Hi and welcome to this video where I'd like to give you a little insight into what I color in a week and how I do it. If you're new to this channel, hi, my name is Ina. If not, welcome back. Normally I don't have any whips, so it doesn't make much sense for me to show you my unfinished pages in a video like this. That's why I thought I would just give you small insights throughout the week. However, thanks to the autumn challenge I did last month, I do have a few whips, and I'll be working on one of them now. I have here the book Morgentau by Maria Trolle, also known as Twilight Garden in English. In this book, I currently have 2 unfinished pages. One is this mandala, where I'd like to add some texture in the background using stencils. You can see this in my haul video, which was published before this one. The second unfinished page is this one with the basket and the squirrel from the autumn challenge. I've already started coloring the branch and one leaf. Now I'll show you how I color autumn leaves, in this case oak leaves. Unlike other leaves, they don't turn reddish, but rather brownish yellow, with maybe a hint of orange. I've already colored one leaf, which turned out quite yellow. This leaf here will look a bit different, just to add some variety. I'm starting with sap green, focusing around the central leaf vein. Because trees draw nutrients and moisture from the leaves back into the tree in autumn, the area at the petiole of the leaf is the last to retain nutrients and water. Next, I'm using cadmium pale green around the darker green areas. When choosing the shades of green, I deliberately opted for a more yellowish green to ensure everything blends well together. Now I'm using green gold, applying another layer around it. I try to keep these layers uneven, to create a more random appearance. Sometimes I'm color right to the edge, sometimes I don't. I want each leaf to look a little bit different. For this one, I've used quite a bit of yellow and a bit of ochre at the top. On this leaf, after the green gold, I'm going straight to yellow ochre light. As a base, by the way, I mentioned in previous videos, I've drawn with a felted pen on a plastic sheet and then applied it with a damp brush to the page to create a slightly green base. Next, I'm using terracotta, followed by burnt ochre. The color on the lower part of the leaf has turned out a bit too strong, so I'm applying less pressure on the rest of the leaf. And I'm also going over it again with the previous color to tone down the bright orange appearance. For the other leaf, I'm using yellow ochre light again, and to give it a slightly browner look, I'll add some terracotta to the tip. I continue in the same way with the other leaves, and you'll see the finished picture in my completed page video at the beginning of December. I completely forgot to show you how I started this page with the scorpion from Astrology by Anna Jahre. In any case, I've already spent quite some time on it and tried to bring in a bit of an Arizona desert vibe. As you can see, I've left out the main figure, the scorpion, So far, because I'm still unsure about how I want to color it. My initial thought was to go with dark brown or black, but then I discovered that in this region there are actually one or even two yellowish ochre colored scorpions. Now I'm considering coloring it that way. I'm handling it the way I usually do when I'm not sure how to color something. I color everything else first and then see what fits best. Accordingly, I'm starting with the cactus flowers. For the background, meaning the ground, I use two layers of watercolor pencils. Initially, I started with just one layer and planned to go over it with colored pencils, but I decided to add a second layer of watercolor pencils because I really liked how the first layer turned out. For the cacti, I also did a base layer with watercolor pencils and then went over it with regular colored pencils, the Castle Art Soft Touch, just like on the previous page. Since the flowers are relatively small, I didn't bother with a base layer and just colored directly with pencils. And now these flowers are done. Now I'm focusing on these ones up here, which I'd like to color in an orange-red shade. I've chosen vermilion, scarlet red, and cadmium orange. For the middle part of the flowers, I'm using brilliant yellow, just like with the other flowers. I just realized that I missed a small part of the sky, but that's not a problem, because I was planning to add a second layer of watercolor pencils to the sky anyway, just like I did with the ground. Since the flowers are so small, I don't even try to individually color each petal with a gradient. Instead, I just color them roughly, as no one will check if every petal had the perfect gradient in the end. Alright, I will color the other flowers the same way, and then I have to decide how to color the scorpion. Since the scorpion is quite large, I've decided to go with the yellow ochre colored scorpion. I found a stock photo of a desert hairy scorpion, which isn't the best in terms of colors, but the better images I found are copyrighted, so I can't show them. However, this at least gives you a small glimpse of what the scorpion looks like in real life, which I'm using as a reference. I decided against a brown or black scorpion because, given its size, a relatively large part of the page would have become quite dark, and I think that wouldn't look as good. I'm starting with the scorpion's body, which is darker than the limbs and tail. Here you can also see how I'm coloring a part of the tail. I now finished coloring the scorpion, and the sky will definitely get a second layer of watercolor pencils to make the colors a bit more vibrant and even. And then the page will be done. Although it took quite a long time, much longer than I usually need for a page. With the scorpion finished, I'm starting another page in this book, The Element of Water. Here too, I'm beginning with a base of watercolor pencils from Castle Arts. For the ropes around it, I'm using a light layer of cinnamon. While coloring, I realized that I could have used different colors for the different ropes. However, it's a bit tricky to see which rope is which, since some just get thicker without any clear reason, or randomly end somewhere. Where does this rope go, and where does that one come from? It's not entirely clear. Accordingly, it's actually a good idea to color all the ropes in the same shade, as it won't be as noticeable in the end if not every rope has a clear starting point. I want to color the porthole in a brass tone, using prime rose yellow and yellow ochre as the base. First, I mark the lighter areas with a brighter color, before filling in the darker sections with yellow ochre. I'm also using a stock photo as a reference, but I don't intend to replicate it exactly. On one hand, the photo includes the reflection of the person who took it, which I don't want. On the other hand, shiny metal always looks different depending on how the light hits it. Another point is that I don't have the exact colored pencils to achieve the same brass tone as in the photo. When I do such a base layer, knowing that I will color over it anyway, I tend to do it very quickly and roughly, even though it might make more sense to take more time. Is it the same for you, or do you already do the first layer very neatly? I let that dry overnight and then started with the colored pencils the next day. It actually took me an entire evening just to color the ropes, but since that wasn't particularly exciting, I didn't film it. Now, another day later, I've started on the porthole. As I mentioned, I don't have the right colored pencils to match the colors from the inspiration photo. So the brass has turned out a bit too golden for my taste. But that's how it is now, and it's not a big deal. I think it will still look harmonious in the end. For the darker areas, I'm using chrome green to deepen the shadows and to suggest a bit of patina. Since brass reflects light and thus always looks different depending on the light source, there's really no wrong or right when it comes to the coloring, as long as it looks cohesive. There will likely be little light hitting the edges, so that's where I'm placing the shadow areas. I'm now layering raw umber over the chrome green to reduce the greenish appearance. Since I haven't found a matching color tone, I need to layer these two colors. Next, I'm using yellow ochre. The chrome green naturally creates a sharper transition, but if you look at brass, you'll often find hard transitions from light to dark areas, even harder than what I'm doing here. The next color I'm using is yellow ochre light, followed by golden yellow. Since there's probably not much light reaching this intermediate space, I'm filling the area with golden yellow. On this curve, however, where it's likely the brightest, I'm using my lightest color, which is primrose yellow. Next, I'm focusing on the rod, and when I look at the reference again, there's not only a dark color at the edges, but also an additional line. So I'm adding that here as well. I'm not sure if it will look good in the end, but I'm just going for it. I'm coloring it now with the same color combination as before and making the line slightly thicker with each lighter shade. This way, there's still enough space for the highlight in the middle. I'm quite pleased with how it looks so far, but now the question is how to handle the larger areas. I'll start with the area under this joint, where there are definitely shadows, just like around the rivets. I would also say the large ring with the rivets is lower than the small ring next to it, so there will be some shadow there as well. And now I'm filling this area just like before. Okay, this area is done too. I think where I applied a lighter base, I will also color it accordingly lighter, but still draw in the shadows from the rivets and rings. Then I also darken some areas in general. I now color the rivets using the same principle. However, I always want to keep the area outside this small curved line light, and accordingly I place the shadow on the opposite side, especially on those rivets where nothing is overlapping. Maybe I trace these lines with a white pen at the end, but I'll decide that later. Okay, I continue now without filming. I finished most of it, and now the next day I'll work on this last part together with you. I've decided that this small ring is the highest one, and the ones on either side are underneath it, just like this one, where you can only see part of it, which is even a bit lower. Accordingly, I've always drawn shadows along the edges here. Now I'm adding a shadow edge on the outside as well. Additionally, a slightly darker area is added to the outer side, as well as around the rivets. In the lighter areas, I do use chrome green, but I don't apply the darkest color over it, instead opting for yellow ochre light. I'm now using yellow ochre light a bit generously in the darker areas, starting with light pressure and applying more pressure toward the darker areas. Then I'm going over the areas again with golden yellow, all the way to the highlights, which I color with primrose yellow. Now that the brass is finished, I'm focusing on the inner area. Here I found an inspiration image for the moon, the clouds and the water. Again, I'm starting with the base layer using Castle Arts watercolor pencils, beginning with jade green. I'll start with the sky, applying light pressure as I don't want the color to be too intense. Then I'll use primrose yellow for the moon, the same color I used for the porthole. Next, I'm using jade green again to color the edges of the clouds and the upper edge of the water. I don't want the overall picture to be as dark as my reference image, but I do want some darker areas in the shadows. For this, I'm using teal green to color the rest of the clouds and water, applying more pressure as I move downward to make it slightly darker. While coloring, I just thought it would be nice if the water had a bit more of a bluish tint. That's why I'm going over the darker areas of the water again with some primary blue. Next, I'm blending everything with water, always working from the light areas toward the darker ones, to avoid making the bright section too dark. I also have a cloth nearby to dab off any excess dark color from the brush whenever needed. Now I let everything dry completely. Once it's dry, I prepared a few pencils. For the clouds, I'm using a turquoise tone from Faber-Castell's pastel series, followed by mint green light, then mint green and finally jade green as the darkest shade. For the water, I'll use darker tones as well, such as teal green light and cypress green. But for now, I start with the first cloud. Now I show you how I color this wave, or rather this small one. I really like how it's turning out, and I'll continue working on it the same way the next day. But this is where the video ends for now. I hope you enjoyed this little insight into my coloring week, even though I only worked on a few pages because they were quite time consuming. Bye and see you next time.